Two sisters left their grandmother's lake house for an evening walk and never returned. By the next morning, their beds hadn't been slept in. By the third day, the lake had been dragged twice and the surrounding woods searched on foot by nearly 100 volunteers. By the time the case went cold, the official theory was that they'd drowned and simply never been recovered. But the lake had nothing to do with it. And the man who organized those dragging operations, who stood waist deep in that water for 3 straight days, searching for 2 bodies he insisted must be down there, had been the last person to see them alive, a fact he never once disclosed. This is Pine Hollow, Vermont, August 2009. Leila Maren was 19, the older of the 2 sisters, quiet and watchful. The kind of person who noticed things other people missed and rarely said anything about it until it mattered. Recently finished with her first year of college and considering a degree in environmental science, something her grandmother liked to joke she'd inherited from all those childhood summers spent cataloging frogs and insects along the lake's shoreline. Sophie Maren was 16, brighter, louder, the one who made friends easily and dragged her older sister along to things Leila would never have gone to on her own. A competitive swimmer who'd spent the prior spring qualifying for regional finals and talked, that summer, about little else besides her plans for the following season. They'd come to Pine Hollow for what had become a near-annual tradition, 2 weeks each August at their grandmother's lake house, a modest cabin on the quieter, less developed side of Hollow Lake that had been in the family for 3 generations. Their grandmother, Eleanor Maren, was 71, sharp and independent. The kind of woman who still chopped her own firewood and considered the girls' summer visits the highlight of her year, the 2 weeks she planned her entire calendar around. August 9th, 2009, a Sunday evening, warm and still, the lake glassy in the way it only got in late summer when the wind dropped entirely after sunset. The girls told their grandmother they were going for their usual evening walk along the shore path that connected the cabin to a small public access point about a mile down. A walk they'd done dozens of times that summer alone, and together, always back before dark. Eleanor watched them head down the path just after 7, Sophie still in her swimsuit cover-up from an afternoon swim, Leila carrying a flashlight neither of them ended up needing yet, given how much daylight remained. That was the last time Eleanor Maren saw her granddaughters. When 8 o'clock came and went without the girls returning, Eleanor wasn't immediately alarmed, assuming they'd stopped to talk with neighbors or lost track of time the way teenagers do. By 9, with full dark settling in and no sign of them, she called the only neighbor whose number she had, a man who'd lived on the lake's access road for as long as anyone could remember. That neighbor was Russell Tate, 44, a longtime Pine Hollow resident who worked seasonal maintenance for several of the lake's older properties, including, for years, the Maren family cabin itself. Tate had grown up on the lake's access road, in a house that had belonged to his family for 3 generations before his own, and was widely regarded around Pine Hollow as one of the few remaining people who genuinely knew the lake's history, its old property lines, its forgotten corners, knowledge he was generally happy to share at the hardware store or over coffee at the diner that served as the town's unofficial gathering spot. He'd helped the Maren girls more than once that summer with small tasks around the cabin, fixing a dockboard, hauling firewood, the kind of easy, unremarkable favors that came naturally in a community where everyone had known everyone for decades. Tate told Eleanor he'd walked the shore path himself to look for the girls before involving anyone further. A generous, neighborly offer that Eleanor accepted gratefully given how well he knew the property and the surrounding trails. He returned 40 minutes later, alone, reporting that he'd walked the full path to the public access point and back, and seen no sign of either girl. No dropped flashlight, No footprints he could identify in the dim light. Nothing. It was Tate, in fact, who suggested calling the sheriff's department immediately rather than waiting any longer. A suggestion Eleanor would later describe, after everything came out, as the single detail that had made her trust him completely in the chaos of that night. The Pine Hollow County Sheriff's Department arrived within the hour and organized an initial search of the shore path and surrounding woods, working through the night with flashlights and a handful of volunteer firefighters. By morning, with no trace of either girl found anywhere along the path, attention turned to the lake itself, the assumption forming quickly and taking hold even faster that the girls had perhaps gone for an evening swim, despite their grandmother's understanding that they hadn't. That something had gone wrong in the water. A cramp. A current. The kind of quiet tragedy that happens on lakes every single summer, somewhere in America, and rarely makes headlines beyond the local paper. Russell Tate, given his intimate knowledge of the lake's depths, currents, and underwater terrain from decades of seasonal maintenance work on properties along its shore, was brought in almost immediately as an informal advisor to the dive and dragging operations that began on day 2. He knew which sections ran deepest, where old underwater debris from a decommissioned boathouse decades earlier might complicate recovery efforts, where the lake bed dropped off sharply enough to trap a body against an underwater ledge. Lead investigator Detective Maren Pruitt later said that Tate's knowledge had been, at the time, an enormous asset to the search. He probably knew that lake bed better than anyone alive. We leaned on him heavily those first few days, and at the time it felt like exactly the kind of community support you hope for in a situation like that. For 3 full days, dragging operations covered nearly the entire accessible portion of Hollow Lake, divers working in shifts despite poor visibility in the lake's deeper, silt-heavy sections. Tate was present for nearly every hour of it, standing waist-deep in shallow areas directing volunteer boats, occasionally diving himself in sections he insisted he knew well enough to check personally, returning to the surface again and again with nothing, each time shaking his head, each time apologizing to Eleanor as though the failure were somehow his own to carry. Volunteers who worked alongside him during those 3 days later described him, almost uniformly, as tireless, the kind of presence that made an unbearable search feel slightly less hopeless simply by virtue of his refusal to stop. By the end of the 3rd day, with no trace of either girl recovered from the water and the search beginning to exhaust both manpower and daylight, Detective Pruitt made the difficult call to scale back the dragging operation and shift resources toward a broader land search. A decision Tate reportedly argued against at the time, insisting the girls had to be in the water somewhere, that the search simply hadn't covered enough of the lake bed yet. An argument Pruitt later said she found, at the time, genuinely persuasive given how thoroughly he seemed to understand the terrain beneath the surface. The land search that followed covered nearly 3,000 acres of forest surrounding the lake over the following 2 weeks, volunteers walking grid patterns through dense Vermont woodland, cadaver dogs brought in from 2 neighboring counties, state police search and rescue teams working alongside local volunteers. Nothing surfaced. No clothing, no personal items, no trace evidence of any kind along the shore path or in the surrounding forest. On day 11, a hunter reported what he believed was a torn piece of fabric caught on brush nearly 4 miles from the cabin, prompting a full-day search of that section of forest before lab analysis confirmed the fabric had no connection to the case at all. By the end of the 2nd week, the official search was scaled back to periodic review status. The working theory, never formally confirmed but widely accepted within the department and the community, settling on the lake itself, 2 bodies presumed lost somewhere in its depths. never recovered. A tragedy attributed to misadventure rather than anything more deliberate. Eleanor Maren never accepted that theory. Not fully. Not once, in the years that followed. She told anyone who would listen that her granddaughters were strong swimmers, that Sophie in particular had competed on her high school swim team, that neither girl would have gone into the lake at dusk without telling her, that something about the official explanation never sat right, no matter how many times investigators walked her through the dragging logs and the dive team's coverage maps. She kept the cabin exactly as it had been that August for years afterward, the girls' belongings still in the bedroom they'd shared, returning every summer despite the grief it cost her, unable to fully explain even to herself why she kept coming back to the one place that held both her best memories of them and her worst. Each August, on the anniversary of their disappearance, she walked the shore path alone at the exact hour they'd left the cabin, a ritual neighbors grew accustomed to seeing without ever quite knowing how to acknowledge it. Russell Tate remained a fixture in the Pine Hollow community throughout the years that followed, continuing his seasonal maintenance work, occasionally mentioned in town as the man who dived for days trying to find those two girls, a reputation that, if anything, only burnished his standing among neighbors who remembered his exhausting, selfless effort during that terrible week. He attended the annual memorial gathering Eleanor organized each August at the lake, standing respectfully near the back, offering quiet condolences that Eleanor, for years, received with genuine gratitude. In the spring of 2023, nearly 14 years after the girls disappeared, a prolonged drought dropped Hollow Lake's water level lower than it had been in over 3 decades, exposing sections of shoreline and lakebed that hadn't seen open air since before the girls were even born. A retired engineer doing informal water level surveys for a local environmental group, walking a newly exposed stretch of shoreline roughly 2 miles from the original search area, far beyond anywhere the 2009 dragging operations had covered, noticed something embedded in the cracked, dried mud that didn't belong there. A corner of stonework too regular, too deliberately fitted, to be natural formation. He photographed it and reported it to the county the same afternoon, assuming, by his own later account, that he'd simply stumbled on some forgotten piece of old farm infrastructure. Nothing more. What he'd found, county investigators determined within days, was the partial remains of a small structure, a root cellar or storm shelter of some kind, built decades earlier into a low embankment that would have sat well underwater during the lake's normal water levels, accessible, under typical conditions, only by diving to a depth few recreational swimmers or even search divers would have reason to investigate without specific cause. Inside, forensic teams recovered skeletal remains, ultimately identified through dental records as belonging to both Lila and Sophie Maren. The discovery confirmed to Eleanor by Detective Pruitt herself, in person, 14 years almost to the week after she'd first reported her granddaughters missing. What unsettled investigators most wasn't simply the discovery itself, but its location. Nearly 2 miles from where every search effort in 2009, every dragging pass, every dive team deployment had been concentrated, all of it directed, in those critical early days, by the one person who'd known the lakebed intimately enough to guide the entire operation. Forensic anthropologist Dr. Owen Castellan, brought in to assess the recovery site, noted in his report that the structure's interior showed clear evidence the girls had been placed there deliberately, in a manner inconsistent with any accidental drowning or natural deposition by water current. Water doesn't carry a body 2 miles and then deposit it neatly inside a sealed structure, he wrote. Someone put them there. Someone who knew this particular structure existed, in a part of the lake nobody was looking, because the person directing the search made sure nobody looked there. Detective Pruitt, who had never fully closed the file despite 14 years of no new leads, immediately began cross-referencing the location against every record connected to the original search. Property surveys, old maintenance logs, anything that might explain who could have known about a submerged structure that didn't appear on any modern lake survey. The work took weeks, sorting through county deed archives and decades-old utility records for properties bordering that stretch of shoreline. The answers surfaced within days of that focused effort. Decades-old county records, recovered from a basement archive, showed that the structure had originally been built as a root cellar for a now-demolished farmhouse, torn down in the 1970s before the lake's water level was later raised by a small dam expansion project. The structure simply left in place and submerged, forgotten by everyone except, as it turned out, the handful of longtime residents whose families had worked that land for generations. Russell Tate's family had owned the adjacent property for 3 generations, a detail confirmed within a single afternoon of records research once investigators knew to look for it. Investigators reopened formal contact with Tate under the framing of routine historical follow-up, a pretense that lasted only until cell tower records from the night of the girl's disappearance, reanalyzed using technology unavailable in 2009, placed his phone in the immediate vicinity of that exact submerged structure for nearly 3 hours that evening, far from the shore path he'd told Eleanor he'd searched. A forensic data analyst working the reanalysis later said the tower triangulation was unusually precise for a case that the rural location's limited tower coverage actually working in investigators' favor, narrowing his position to a radius of less than 200 meters during the exact window the girls vanished. Confronted with the cell data, the property history, and the forensic findings, Tate was brought in for formal questioning in June of 2023. For the better part of 2 days, Tate maintained his original account, insisting he'd searched the shore path as he'd always said, and had no further knowledge of the girl's fate. His manner described by detectives present as the same calm, helpful demeanor he'd carried throughout the original search itself, as though some old instinct for being trusted hadn't fully left him even now. It was the cell tower data specifically, laid out minute by minute against a structure his own family had once owned, that finally broke his composure during a 3rd session. According to his eventual confession, he had encountered the girls on the shore path that evening, engaged them in conversation under the pretext of warning them about a downed tree blocking part of the route, and led them toward what he described as a shortcut he knew well from childhood, a path that took them directly past the submerged structure's old above-water entrance, a portion of which, during that particular summer's unusually low water levels, had briefly been accessible. What followed, according to his confession, escalated in a manner he struggled throughout his interrogation to fully account for, alternating between describing it as a sudden, uncontrolled act and, at other points, suggesting a level of premeditation investigators found difficult to reconcile with his insistence that none of it had been planned. Both girls were killed within that structure that same evening, their bodies sealed inside using debris and stonework Tate himself rearranged before the water level rose again the following spring, returning the structure to its normal submerged state, and with it sealing away the only physical evidence that could have contradicted the drowning theory he then spent the following 3 days, personally, publicly, exhaustively helping to reinforce. Detective Pruitt, who sat across from him during the 3rd session, said afterward that the strangest part of the entire confession wasn't the act itself, but the calm, almost technical precision with which he described concealing it, as though he had rehearsed the explanation privately for 14 years and felt, in some perverse way, relief at finally saying it aloud. "I made sure I was the one in the water," he told investigators, a sentence the lead prosecutor would later repeat slowly to the jury, allowing the silence afterward to do the work no further commentary could. I made sure I was the one telling them where to look, because I already knew where not to. Russell Tate was charged with 2 counts of murder, evidence tampering, and obstruction related to his role directing the original search operation. The trial, held in early 2024, drew significant regional attention specifically for the detail that seemed hardest for the Pine Hollow community to absorb: that the man widely remembered as the search's most dedicated, knowledgeable volunteer had, in fact, been actively steering nearly 100 searchers and an entire law enforcement dragging operation away from the one location that mattered. Eleanor Maren, then 85, attended every day of testimony from a wheelchair, her daughter beside her, listening as 14 years of grief were finally fully explained. Detective Pruitt testified for nearly 6 hours, walking the jury through the original search logs, Tate's directional input during the 2009 dragging operation, and the cell tower data that finally connected him to the structure decades after the fact. Dr. Castellan's forensic findings were presented in painstaking detail: the deliberate placement, the sealed entrance, the unmistakable evidence of intent. A retired volunteer firefighter who had worked alongside Tate during the original dragging operation testified about his memory of those 3 days, describing Tate's apparent exhaustion and persistence as, at the time, the most reassuring thing about an otherwise hopeless search. An account that drew visible discomfort from several jurors once its full implications settled in the room. The defense argued for a lesser charge based on Tate's claim that the killings themselves had been a sudden, unplanned act, a claim the prosecution dismantled methodically by returning, again and again, to the 3 days that followed: the diving, the directing, the calm, exhausting performance of a search for 2 girls he had already placed exactly where he knew no one would think to look. The jury deliberated for just under 7 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts. Before sentencing, Eleanor Maren was given the opportunity to address the court. She did not look at Tate as she spoke, choosing instead to look directly at the jury. "He stood in that water for 3 days," she said. "I brought him coffee. I thanked him. I will spend whatever years I have left understanding that gratitude was the cruelest thing anyone has ever taken from me." Tate was sentenced to consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, the judge noting from the bench that the case represented a uniquely calculated betrayal of community trust, one that didn't simply conceal a crime, but actively recruited the victim's own family into searching in the wrong direction for over a decade. The Pine Hollow community has struggled visibly with the case's aftermath, several longtime residents giving interviews expressing a particular kind of grief specific to having unknowingly trusted, thanked, and relied upon Tate throughout the very search his own actions had rendered meaningless. The diner where he'd spent years sharing stories about the lake's history quietly removed a small community plaque that had once credited him, among other longtime volunteers, for his contributions to local search and rescue efforts over the years. The county sheriff's department has since implemented new protocols requiring independent verification of any search guidance provided by individuals with prior personal or familial connection to a recovery site. Training materials that now reference the Maren case directly, alongside a handful of similar cases nationally that share the same unsettling structure: a trusted insider directing a search away from its own answer. Detective Pruitt, who continued working the case in whatever capacity she could for nearly her entire remaining career, said in her retirement interview that the case taught her something she has never fully been able to shake. "We trusted his knowledge of that lake because it seemed like exactly what we needed in that moment," she said. "Nobody thought to ask why he wanted so badly to be the one holding the map. Eleanor Maren passed away in early 2025, less than a year after the verdict, having lived just long enough to see the truth fully and finally established. She is buried at Pine Hollow's small cemetery alongside both granddaughters, finally laid to rest together after 16 years apart. The lake house remains in the family, maintained now by Eleanor's daughter, who has said she intends to keep it exactly as her mother did. A place that holds both the worst thing that ever happened to her family and, somehow, still, the best memories of two girls who once walked down to the water on an ordinary summer evening and never came home. If you made it to the end, thank you for staying. This story is built from public investigative procedure, forensic methodology, and courtroom testimony patterns documented in real cold case recoveries, reconstructed here as a composite case. Cases like this exist far more often than anyone wants to believe, where the most trusted, knowledgeable voice in the search was the only one who already knew exactly where not to look. What part of this one stayed with you the longest? Tell me in the comments. I read every one. And if these are the cases that follow you out of the room, subscribe, because there are more of them out there. Still waiting beneath water nobody thought to drag twice.